Canada hopes for relief on steel and aluminum tariffs. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is reportedly rejecting any possibility of a deal on the auto sector. Lutnick says there will be no free trade deal without tariffs, that Canada should accept being second to the U.S. on autos, and that cars will be assembled in the United States, not in Canada.
President Trump wants to destroy our auto sector, take down our steel sector, go after a manufacturing sector. I'm not just going to sit back and roll over. Everyone in the world wants our critical minerals, and they'll have an opportunity to get those critical minerals.
What began as a calm trade event in Toronto quickly spiraled into a defining moment for North American relations. The conference hall was filled with optimism, humming with conversation about renewed economic cooperation between Canada and the United States. But that mood shifted the moment the screen flickered to life for a virtual address from Washington. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick appeared, his tone clipped and unyielding. With calculated certainty, he declared that no free trade deal would move forward without tariffs. Canada, he said bluntly, would take a backseat in the auto industry, and vehicle production would begin shifting south to American soil. The silence that followed was thick. Within minutes, the announcement swept across Ontario's industrial towns like a shockwave. In Windsor, auto workers gathered around their phones in disbelief, realizing the livelihood that had sustained families for generations was suddenly in jeopardy. In Ottawa, officials offered no comment, but their silence carried the weight of disbelief and frustration. Only a day earlier, Prime Minister Mark Carney's meeting with President Trump had been described as productive, even hopeful. That optimism evaporated in an instant. What unfolded in Toronto that week marked a decisive turning point in North American trade. What started as an industry conference transformed into a reckoning. The announcement wasn't just another policy adjustment. It was a declaration of dominance. For decades, Canada and the United States have built an industrial engine together, their economies bound by shared manufacturing and open borders. Now, the message from Washington was clear. The partnership had become unequal. Markets responded immediately. Headlines across Ontario captured the mood in stark terms. Washington rejects auto deal. For a province whose identity was forged in factories and assembly lines, it felt like a personal blow. Ontario's auto sector, already under strain from global shifts toward electric vehicles and automation, now faced an even greater test. The United States, emboldened by a resurgent protectionist agenda in Trump's second term, began expanding its tariffs. 25% on Canadian steel, 35% on aluminum, and new levies on heavy machinery and commercial trucks. Washington framed the move as a necessary rebalancing of trade. In Canada, it felt more like punishment. The reality was that both nations' economies were too tightly woven to separate cleanly. Ontario's auto industry depended on a delicate network of supply chains refined over decades. Car parts and components moved back and forth between Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario before a single finished vehicle ever reached a dealership. The moment tariffs hit, those costs multiplied. Automakers on both sides of the border found themselves paying more, waiting longer, and losing competitiveness to foreign rivals whose trade routes ran more smoothly. The tension reached its peak later that afternoon when Ontario Premier Doug Ford addressed the conference. Speaking with a tone rarely seen in Canadian politics, he warned that if Washington insisted on dismantling Canada's auto and steel industries, Ontario could retaliate. The province, he reminded everyone, supplied cheap hydroelectric energy and critical minerals essential for American manufacturing. "It's not an option we want to use," he said, "but it's one we have." The remark was met with applause, a rare moment of unity among politicians, business leaders, and union representatives who had long disagreed on economic strategy that as outrage spread. So too did a quieter realization. America's aggressive trade posture might end up hurting itself. Tariffs drove up the price of raw materials, forcing American carmakers to charge more for vehicles that were already struggling to stay competitive in global markets. Plants in Michigan and Ohio began reporting shortages of key components sourced from Canada. The very tariff designed to protect American jobs were beginning to threaten them in Ottawa. The conversation shifted from damage control to long-term strategy. Canada's policymakers started mapping out where the nation still held real leverage, the kind of structural power that couldn't be erased by a speech or decree. Energy topped that list. Ontario and Quebec supply electricity to several northeastern U.S. states, while Canadian oil and natural gas remain the backbone of America's energy imports. The pipelines and grids linking the two nations are physical reminders of their interdependence. If Canada were to restrict that flow, even slightly, the effect will be immediate and profound. Another area of strength lay beneath Canada's soil. The country possesses some of the world's most significant deposits of critical minerals: nickel, lithium, and cobalt, materials essential for the electric vehicle revolution, modern batteries, and defense technologies. The nickel mines of Sudbury and the aluminum smelters of Quebec feed directly into American supply chains. Even the Pentagon has acknowledged that Canada plays a vital role in securing North America's industrial resilience as Washington seeks to reduce dependence on China. Beyond resources, Canada's consumer market, though small in size, remains a crucial one for American goods. Billions in exports flow north each year, and any disruption in that trade would ripple through U.S. industry from manufacturing to agriculture. The balance of power, though tilted, was not one-sided. By the end of that week, it was clear the Toronto conference will be remembered not for its scheduled speeches or panel discussions, but for how it exposed the shifting ground beneath a once stable alliance. Canada, for decades accustomed to cooperation and compromise, now faced a hard truth. Its economic partnership with the United States was entering a new, more uncertain phase. The calm diplomacy that had long defined their relationship was giving way to open economic confrontation. Yet amid the uncertainty, one thing had become evident. Canada still possessed tools of influence: its energy, its resources, its market, and its unity. The question now was whether it would use them. The decisions made in the months ahead would determine not only the fate of Canada's auto towns and trade ties, but the future shape of North American industry itself. Nearly 40 million Canadians purchase about 2 million vehicles each year, and more than 20% of all U.S.-made cars are sold north of the border. Losing that market wouldn't just dent American exports, it would undercut the very demand many U.S. factories rely on to survive. Japan, by contrast, buys barely 1% of U.S.-built vehicles. For American automakers, Canada isn't a secondary customer. It's one of their largest and most dependable. That deep interdependence forms the foundation of Canada's argument. Breaking trade ties doesn't strengthen the United States, it weakens it. The more Washington tries to centralize control, the more it risks damaging the shared system that has kept both economies stable for decades. Trump's new tariffs were designed to secure America's dominance, but in practice, they made North American manufacturing more expensive and less competitive globally. As one Ontario trade official quietly remarked, every tariff the U.S. imposes on Canada hits Detroit twice as hard. The irony was clear. The very policies meant to protect American industry were eroding it from within. By the end of that turbulent week, what began as an American show of strength had transformed into a moment of political reckoning. Canada's federal and provincial governments began coordinating more closely than they had in years. Premier Doug Ford and Prime Minister Mark Carney, often fierce political rivals, found themselves aligned in defending national industries and workers. Their cooperation wasn't about retaliation, it was about strategy. They understood that Canada's best defense would come not from outrage, but from resilience and preparation. Meanwhile, across the border, the numbers began to reveal the cracks forming in America's economy. Despite confident statements from the White House, U.S. manufacturing output was faltering. Between June and September 2025, factory production fell nearly 2%, marking the steepest decline in 2 years. Inflation edged upward as the cost of imported materials climbed. Profit margins narrowed. Tariffs that had been sold as a path to stability were now introducing volatility instead. Canada, on the other hand, chose a measured path. Rather than escalate with counter-tariffs or public threats, Ottawa focused on reinforcing the sectors that mattered most. Federal policymakers worked to safeguard steel and aluminum producers while seeking out new trade agreements with partners in Europe and Asia. Provincial governments coordinated to ensure that key industries could withstand short-term pressures. It was a calm, almost understated response, but every move was deliberate. Canada was repositioning itself for the future, not reacting to the moment. The new strategy centered on diversification and leverage. In this phase of economic confrontation, power looked different than it once had. It was no longer about press conferences or headline-grabbing policies. It was about understanding the invisible systems of dependency that tied the two economies together. every auto plant in Michigan that relies on Ontario steel, every defense contract that depends on nickel from Sudbury, every car in an American driveway built with Canadian aluminum. Those links revealed how deeply the two nations were entwined and how far Washington could truly push before the damage circled back home. The balance of power was beginning to shift, even if few in Washington were ready to admit it. The tariffs meant to remind Canada of its place were exposing just how interdependent the two countries remained. By targeting its closest ally, the United States was revealing its own vulnerabilities, an economy built on collaboration, not isolation. The industrial web that connected North America had been its greatest strength. To unravel it was to weaken both sides. In Ontario, factories continued to operate under strain. Managers trimmed costs, adjusted supply chains, and waited for policy clarity that never came. But beneath the uncertainty, something new was taking shape. Canada's restraint was beginning to look like a quiet form of power, an understanding that lasting influence comes from endurance, not confrontation. Real strength in trade, as many Canadian officials came to see it, isn't measured by who raises their voice first, but by who stays steady when the other side starts breaking its own rules. That restraint was matched by action. Ottawa began fast-tracking national projects designed to reduce dependence on U.S. routes and build greater self-reliance in global trade. Chief among them was the expansion of the Port of Montreal, an initiative that would become a cornerstone of Canada's new economic strategy. The port, already operating near capacity, had long struggled to keep pace with rising demand. Without expansion, Canada risked bottlenecks that could slow the movement of goods and undermine growth. The new terminal, now moving through early stages of planning, is expected to handle over 1 million additional containers annually. Beyond logistics, the project carries symbolic weight. It represents a shift from reacting to American policy toward charting an independent path in global commerce. The federal government has designated it as one of 5 national priority projects under Bill C-5, ensuring fast approvals and streamlined coordination. A dedicated office has been created to cut through bureaucratic delays, keeping the timeline on track. The economic impact is substantial. Construction alone is projected to create over 1,200 jobs, injecting momentum into local economies. Once operational, the expansion could generate more than 140 million Canadian dollars in annual value through trade activity, transportation services, and supply chain growth. For Canada, the benefits go beyond economics. They represent independence, the ability to move goods, negotiate deals, and sustain industries without depending on decisions made in Washington. Still, the road ahead